Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today we're going to be looking at something pretty important. We're going to be talking about the realities of Indigenous women globally.
Yeah, this is a topic that I think a lot of people maybe have some ideas about. But we have a really fantastic resource here that I think will shed some light. It's called Indigenous Women's Realities, Insights from the Indigenous Navigator. It's a report from 2020. And the really cool thing about it is that it's a collaborative project that actually gathered data directly from Indigenous communities.
Oh wow, so it's like straight from the source. That's got to be pretty powerful. So we're not talking about like outdated stereotypes here. This is real experience.
Exactly. Real experiences, challenges, triumphs.
I'm ready to deep dive.
Okay, so we're going to be talking about a few different things today. We're going to look at the socioeconomic landscape that these women navigate, the barriers that they face in participating in their societies, and the impact of things like COVID-19 on their lives.
Okay, so starting big picture, we're talking over 238 million Indigenous women worldwide. That's a lot of people.
It is a huge number, more than the population of most countries. And what this report highlights is that these women face intersecting discrimination.
Intersecting discrimination.
Yeah, so it's not just gender inequality, it's also prejudice based on their Indigenous identity, their age, income level, all sorts of factors.
So it's like facing multiple hurdles at the same time.
Exactly. It makes it so much harder to overcome those challenges.
And when I was reading through this report, I was really struck by the personal stories.
Oh, absolutely. Those are so powerful. One quote that really stayed with me was a woman who said that she felt colonized even within her own community.
Wow, that's a powerful statement.
It is, and it just goes to show how deep-rooted some of these issues are.
Yeah, for sure. And speaking of deep-rooted issues, the report had some data that I found pretty shocking. Apparently, Indigenous women are twice as likely to experience discrimination when trying to access healthcare.
That's right.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, that's just one example. We see this discrimination in lack of access to education, unfair wages, and even being undermined when it comes to making decisions in their communities.
Oh, wow. You know, when you lay it all out like that,
Yeah.
it really makes you think about those long-term consequences, those systemic inequalities.
Right. It's not just one area of life. It affects everything.
Okay, so let's talk about another really important issue here. Land ownership.
Yes. Now, despite international agreements recognizing Indigenous land rights, the report found that most of the communities surveyed still face limitations on their land.
It's interesting you say that because I was looking at the data comparing collective versus individual land ownership, and it really seemed to vary across continents, like different cultural norms are at play.
Oh, for sure. And those cultural norms are so important to consider because one of the respondents in the report said something that was really interesting. She said that women are often just beneficiaries of land, not owners.
So they might benefit from the land, but they don't actually have control over it.
Exactly. And that lack of ownership can really limit their economic opportunities and even their own personal autonomy.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
And this connection to the land is so important, especially during times of crisis like the COVID-19 pandemic. The report actually contrasted rural communities who rely on their land for food security with those in urban areas who really struggled when movement was restricted.
Right, because their access to food was directly tied to their land.
Exactly. So that access to land is vital not just for cultural reasons, but for survival.
And on that note, I think we should move on to another really tough topic.
Okay.
The report spends a lot of time talking about violence against women and girls.
Yes, it's a disturbing trend, unfortunately. And while it's a very difficult topic to discuss, it's so important that we understand what these women are facing.
You're absolutely right. We can't shy away from it. And the data on domestic violence in these communities is very alarming.
It is. And it's made even worse by the fact that speaking out can be really difficult. There's an interview in the report with a woman who talked about how scared she was to come forward because of how close-knit her community is.
Oh, wow. So it's like this fear of retaliation
Yeah.
from the people you're supposed to be closest to.
Exactly. It must feel incredibly isolating.
It must.
Yeah.
But, amidst all of these challenges, were there any signs of hope or positive change happening?
Oh, definitely. The report highlighted that almost half of the communities surveyed rely on customary law to deal with domestic violence. And there was one story about a village leader who stepped in to protect a woman from harm.
Oh, that's good to hear. To know that there are people in these communities working to make things better.
Absolutely. Local solutions can and do work.
And speaking of creating positive change, I know the report also dives into the issue of education.
Right. Education is often seen as a pathway to empowerment, but there are some pretty disheartening trends that the report highlights. Well, for example, school completion rates for girls decline significantly as education levels increase.
So the higher the level of education, the fewer girls are finishing.
Yeah, and it's a reminder that those barriers to education are often a lot higher for Indigenous women.
It's like this vicious cycle, isn't it?
Yeah.
Limited education leads to fewer opportunities, which then contributes to the cycle of poverty and inequality.
Absolutely, and the report points out that Africa in particular has the widest gender gaps in education.
That makes sense if we think back to those issues of poverty and cultural norms that we were talking about earlier.
Right, it's all connected.
And to put some of those statistics into perspective, the report mentions things like adolescent pregnancy, early marriage, and having to work to support families as reasons why girls drop out of school.
Yeah, those are very real pressures that a lot of young women are facing.
For sure.
But, it's not all bad news. There was one community highlighted in the report where they increased scholarship availability, and that actually led to a 20% increase in university attendance.
Wow, that's amazing.
It is. It shows that targeted interventions can make a real difference.
Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the economic landscape for Indigenous women.
Right.
Because these women are making significant contributions to their local economies. But the report points out something that's a little bit concerning. Indigenous women are really underrepresented in formal employment, and they often lack basic social protections.
That's right.
So why do you think that is?
Well, if we think back to our discussion earlier, those barriers to education and the discrimination that they face, those play a huge role in limiting their opportunities right from the start.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. It's all connected.
Yeah.
But the report also takes a look at something that I found really interesting. The world of traditional occupations,
Oh, yeah.
like agriculture, handicrafts,
Yeah.
care work.
Right. Those are often overlooked in mainstream economic discussions,
Exactly.
but they're so important.
And I thought it was fascinating to see the contrast between those traditional roles
Mm-hmm.
and this rising trend of entrepreneurship among Indigenous women.
Oh, yeah. There are some great stories in the report about women who are starting their own businesses.
It's really inspiring.
It is, especially considering the impact of COVID-19.
Right, because the pandemic really hit these women hard, especially those who relied on traditional markets to sell their goods and services.
Exactly. All those restrictions on movement and market access, it was devastating for a lot of women.
It must have been. But on a more positive note, the report actually highlights how the pandemic also led to some incredible innovation.
Oh, yeah.
Like women who quickly pivoted to online platforms to sell their products.
It's amazing how quickly they were able to adapt.
It really is. So speaking of amazing women doing amazing things, I know the report also highlights the role of Indigenous women's organizations.
Oh, absolutely. Those organizations are on the front lines doing incredible work.
Yeah, they're involved in everything from advocating for women's rights to providing support during the pandemic, to mentoring young professionals.
They're really filling a vital gap, doing work that governments and institutions often fail to do.
I was really struck by their impact. It seems like they're really making a difference.
They are. And it's not just about providing services. It's about empowering women to take control of their own lives and their communities.
Exactly. But the report also suggests that they need more support to really thrive.
That's right. More resources, funding, capacity building.
It's a call to action for all of us.
It is.
So after diving deep into this report, what are your big takeaways about the realities of Indigenous women today?
Well, one thing that is so clear to me is the incredible resilience and resourcefulness of these women. They face all these enormous challenges, yet they continue to find ways to adapt, to innovate, and to create a better future.
I agree. It's really inspiring. What about you? What stood out to you the most?
I think what really struck me was the power of collective action, whether it's traditional governance structures or community-based solutions to violence, or the work of those Indigenous women's organizations. Working together is key.
Yeah, I think that's a powerful message for all of us.
Yeah.
We can all play a role in supporting these efforts, whether it's donating to organizations, educating ourselves, or simply amplifying the voices of Indigenous women.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that it's not about imposing our solutions. It's about listening to Indigenous women, understanding their needs, and supporting their self-determined goals.
It's about partnership, not charity.
Exactly. And that's where the report's call for more focused data collection comes in. We need to go beyond the broad statistics and really dig into the specific experiences of Indigenous women.
To make sure their voices are heard.
Yes, exactly. Their perspectives need to be understood.
Yeah.
And their leadership needs to be recognized.
We need to make sure they have a seat at the table and
Exactly.
decisions are being made that affect their lives.
Yeah, it's rare.
Their knowledge and their experiences are so valuable.
Absolutely. And sadly, this lack of control over land, it can have a really devastating impact on women's safety. The report reveals a pretty disturbing trend when it comes to violence against women and girls.
Yeah, that's something we definitely can't shy away from.
No, absolutely not. And it's a tough topic to discuss, but it's crucial that we understand the reality of what these women are facing.
You're right, it is. And what's particularly alarming is the data on domestic violence. It's really prevalent in these communities.
It is, and it's made even worse by the fact that, speaking out against this violence can be incredibly difficult. There's an interview in the report with a woman who talks about how scared she was to come forward, just because of, how close-knit her community is.
Yeah, I can imagine that, like that fear of retaliation
Yeah.
from the people you're supposed to be closest to.
Exactly. It must be
Clear.
so isolating.
It must. But I'm curious, amidst all these challenges, were there any signs of hope? Any positive change happening?
Oh, yeah, definitely. The report highlighted that almost half of the communities they surveyed actually rely on customary law to address domestic violence.
Oh, interesting.
And there was a story about a village leader who actually stepped in to protect a woman from harm.
Oh, that's good to hear that there are people working to address these issues.
Yeah, it shows that local solutions can and do work.
For sure. So let's shift gears a bit
Mm-hmm.
and talk about education,
Okay.
because that's often seen as a pathway to empowerment, right?
Right.
But I know the report highlights some pretty disheartening trends.
It does. For example, school completion rates for girls decline significantly as education levels increase.
So the higher the level of education, the fewer girls are finishing.
Exactly. And it's a reminder that, those barriers to education are often much higher for Indigenous women.
It's like this vicious cycle, isn't it? Limited education, fewer opportunities,
Mhm.
which then contributes to that cycle of poverty and inequality.
It is. And the report points out that Africa in particular has the widest gender gaps in education.
Yeah, that makes sense if we think back to, the poverty and the cultural norms that we were talking about earlier.
Exactly. It's all connected.
And, to put some of those statistics in perspective, the report talks about things like adolescent pregnancy, early marriage, and the need to work to support their families. It's some of the reasons why girls drop out of school.
Yeah, those are all very real pressures that a lot of young women face.
They are.
But it's not all bad news. The report highlights a community where they increased scholarship availability, and that actually led to a 20% increase in university attendance.
Wow, that's incredible.
It shows that these targeted interventions can really make a difference.
Okay, so let's talk about the economic landscape for Indigenous women, because we know that these women are making huge contributions to their local economies. But the report shows that they're really underrepresented in formal employment, and they often lack basic social protections.
That's right.
So why is that?
Well, if we think back to our conversation about the barriers to education
Yeah.
and the discrimination that they face, those play a huge role in limiting their opportunities.
Yeah, that makes sense. It all ties together.
It does.
But what I found really interesting is that the report also looks at traditional occupations.
Oh, yeah.
Things like agriculture, handicrafts, care work.
Right. Those are often overlooked.
They are.
But they're so important to these communities.
And I thought it was really interesting to see this contrast between those traditional roles and this rising trend of entrepreneurship among Indigenous women.
Yeah, there's some really great stories in the report about women who are starting their own businesses.
It's really inspiring.
It is. And it's even more remarkable when you consider the impact of COVID-19.
Oh, right, because those restrictions really must have had a huge impact on women who rely on traditional markets.
It did. Those restrictions on movement and market access were really devastating for a lot of women.
For sure.
But the silver lining is that the pandemic also led to some incredible innovation.
Oh, like what?
Well, the report talks about women who were able to quickly pivot to online platforms to sell their goods and services.
Wow, so they found a way to adapt.
They did. It's amazing.
It really is. So speaking of amazing women, let's talk about the role of Indigenous women's organizations.
Oh, those organizations are doing such important work.
They are. They're advocating for women's rights, providing support during the pandemic, mentoring young professionals.
They're really filling a vital gap.
They are.
Doing work that governments and other institutions often fail to do.
I was really struck by their impact. It seems like they're really making a difference in these communities.
They are, and it's important to remember that it's not just about providing services. It's about empowering these women to take control of their own lives and their communities.
Exactly.
But the report does say that they need more support to truly thrive.
Like what kind of support?
Well, increased resources, funding, capacity building, so they can really expand their reach and their impact.
So it's a call to action for all of us.
It is.
So after diving into this report, what are your main takeaways about the realities of Indigenous women today?
Well, one thing that's become so clear to me is the incredible resilience and resourcefulness of these women. They face all of these huge challenges, but they continue to find ways to adapt and innovate and create a better future for themselves and their communities.
Yeah, I agree. It's truly inspiring. What about you? What stood out to you the most?
I think what really struck me was the power of collective action, whether it's those traditional governance structures or the community-based solutions to violence or those Indigenous women's organizations. It's clear that working together is key.
Yeah, and that's a message that resonates with me too. We can all play a role in supporting these efforts, whether it's donating to organizations,
Yeah.
educating ourselves, or just amplifying the voices of Indigenous women.
Absolutely. And it's so important to remember that it's not about us imposing our solutions. It's about listening to Indigenous women, understanding their needs, and supporting their self-determined goals.
It's about partnership, not charity.
Exactly. And that's where the report's call for more focused data collection comes in. We need to go beyond these broad statistics and really dig into the specific experiences of these women.
To make sure that their voices are heard.
Exactly. Their perspectives need to be understood, and their leadership needs to be recognized.
It's about making sure they have a seat at the table
Yeah.
when decisions are being made. That affects their lives.
Yet.
Their knowledge and their experiences are so valuable.
They are.
It's easy to feel kind of overwhelmed,
Yeah.
by all the challenges that we've been talking about.
Yeah.
But the report doesn't just focus on the negative. It really highlights this theme of hope and the agency of these women, their determination to shape their own futures.
Yeah, that's so important. It's not just about the problems. It's about recognizing their strength and their resilience.
For sure.
I mean, take those traditional occupations we were talking about. Some are declining, but others are being revitalized, adapted for new markets. They're honoring their heritage while also looking ahead.
It's like weaving the old and the new together.
Exactly.
And that entrepreneurial spirit is amazing.
It is.
They're not waiting for change to happen. They're making it happen.
Yeah, they really are.
Building businesses,
Yeah.
advocating for their rights.
It's inspiring.
It is. And those Indigenous women's organizations,
Yeah.
they're doing so much.
They are.
Providing support, promoting cultural preservation,
They're the backbone of so many communities.
filling those gaps where governments and institutions aren't.
Yeah,
It really shows the power of grassroots action.
it does.
But the report also emphasizes the need for more support
Yeah, more resources, more funding.
so they can really make a difference.
Right.
So for our listeners out there, what can we do to help support these efforts?
Well, there are so many ways to get involved. You can donate to an organization, educate yourself about the issues, even just amplify their voices on social media.
Small actions can make a difference.
Absolutely.
And I think it's important to remember, it's not about imposing our solutions. It's about listening to these women,
Right.
understanding their needs.
And supporting their goals.
Exactly.
And that's where the report's call for more focused data collection is so important. We need to go beyond those broad statistics and really understand the unique experiences of Indigenous women.
Their voices need to be heard,
Exactly.
their perspectives understood, and their leadership recognized.
Yes,
They need a seat at the table
absolutely.
when decisions are being made that affect their lives.
For sure.
This deep dive has been incredible, challenging at times, but ultimately really inspiring.
I agree.
I hope everyone listening feels empowered to learn more and to support the amazing work being done
Me too.
for Indigenous women all over the world.
It's so
This
important.
is just the start of the conversation.
It is.
And by listening and learning and taking action, we can all contribute to a more just and equitable world.
Absolutely.